Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
I'm excited about our guest today. Our guest has been a friend of mine and, more importantly, a mentor to me for over a decade. He is an educator, a TEDx speaker, an international speaker, and he's been very involved in technology, in the technology community. Ken is especially involved in the intersection between technology, education, and equity. He calls it sometimes tequity. Ken Shelton is our speaker. But to give our listeners just a little context before we begin, this podcast is being recorded in the aftermath of the shooting of Jacob Blake and the NBA players holding an unprecedented sports boycott. There's so much happening right now that I welcome Ken to the show, but I have to ask you, Ken, how are you doing?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and spend this time with you. And I appreciate you asking how I'm doing. I've been better. I've been worse, but I would say that I'm doing like most of us, especially at this time, are taking things day to day. But I'm just wondering, what the proverbial, is that a light at the end of the tunnel or is that a train?
I wanted to kind of lead into all of the issues that are happening out there are bleeding into education, yet we still have educators that are afraid to address this topic. And as an administrator for over 30 years, I knew that there were inequities out there, and I think many of my colleagues have known it. Now there's a spotlight on it, and COVID really put that spotlight on there for us. I think probably, if I'm honest, we didn't address it because we didn't want to know the answers. We probably didn't want to see what was real. And I don't think we can hide from it anymore. I think it's time, the time is here. So what I would like to ask you at this time is that now that equity has finally been exposed, what are the right questions that we should be asking as educators? And I'm speaking as educators at district office and educators in the classroom.
Right. Well, first of all, I'm glad you're bringing that up. The thing is it really is important to understand that it's very easy to deny a problem exists if you refuse to acknowledge that that problem is there in the first place. So I agree with you that there has been quite a bit that has essentially been, unsurfaced, or, the best way I would describe it is people's eyelids have been pulled open to where they can't close them. Because, once you see something, you can't deny its existence unless, of course, you want to engage in gaslighting. But, to answer your question, I think there's a couple of things. One is to recognize that inequities exist within, honestly, most, if not almost all of our social institutions, and education is not exempt from that. With what we're all navigating now, you can see the inequities within our healthcare system, within accessibility to healthcare. I can tell you that back when I was teaching in the classroom, not my last school, but the school, 2 schools prior, I talked with the students. We did some projects around community empowerment, because one of the things that I've always had such a vehement disdain and problem for is the application of responsibility for things like healthcare, eating healthy, living healthy lives on the individual without looking at, the fact that school located in a food desert. And we did an analysis of this, by the way. I did it with my students. You had a community of probably about 80 to 90,000, and there was only one hospital in that community. You also had within, I would say, if I remember correctly, this is a number of years ago, if I remember correctly, one of the other things we looked at was the frequency of health food stores versus liquor stores. And of course, there were no health food stores around. Right. But you go basically 2 blocks from school, and you could find 2 blocks from the school in all 4 directions, so northeast, southwest, and you could find 3 liquor stores.
Right.
And of course, my guess is the way the zoning laws were set up is that you can't be within 2 blocks of school.
Right.
So that's why they were set up,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so then the reason why I'm sharing that is because if you look in terms of, you know, to your point around school leadership, whether it's district level, county level, site level, and then of course the support staff and the teachers, is that you're operating within a system or an institution that by design has inequities. And yeah, some of those we see now, but many of the inequities that are seen now have existed even all the way back to when I was in school. And this is precisely, as you shared at the beginning, precisely why I bring it up and have been bringing it up for going on 10 plus years now, and in varying degrees. And so, you know, I think for me, if there are leaders listening to this, which I'm sure that there are, you know, the question that I would encourage you to ask yourself is, you know, the decisions I make and then the culture that I either perpetuate or that I would like in my school district, how do those ensure that every student has as few obstacles as possible towards on their pathway towards being successful? And I would stress that successful is subjective. So, you know, to me, the school leaders that I work with, I stress the fact that if I'm a child and I'm in your school district, what options should I have by the time I turn 18?
Absolutely.
You see, it's not always going to be college, and it shouldn't always have to be college.
No.
This is why I'm such a staunch advocate for career and technical education options as well. You know, the key is options, and to recognize that for every student that drops out, or for every student that by the time they're 18, and I would say 18, 19, or 20, if they're incarcerated or if they're unemployed, that student didn't fail. The system failed them. Because by the time they turned 18, or if they dropped out, by the time they drop out, they did not have options.
Right. So options and opportunities, right? I know in our district, we looked at some things, we did some equity audits, and we looked at like our orchestra. Does it look like our population? No, we did not have kids of color. And then come to find out you had to have piano lessons, or, you know, to get into something, which, okay, there's the gatekeeper right there. The piano lessons cost money. Not everybody can afford that. And so kind of looking at those policies that we have in place. And I think that districts are really going to have to look hard and realize it's painful to look at these things and realize what you've been doing was not good for kids. And that hurts to hear that. But as Maya Angelou says, when we know better, we do better.
Yep. Do the best you can until you know better, and when you know better, do better. I always have been, I would say, amongst my top 5, Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison they're in my top 5 as far as my favorites go. I put them in there with Malcolm X and James Baldwin. So yeah.
Absolutely.
You know what though? Look, you know, with the point you're making, I think it's important to recognize and to share with your audience that when you hold a mirror up to yourself, what do you want to see? I mean, we all have our own imperfections. I mean, there's Dr. Brene Brown, who I'm a big fan of, you know, our imperfections. She says our imperfections can be our gifts. I would say we have to recognize the imperfections that can be a gift, and then also recognize the imperfections that, you know, can cause the predictability of student success. And it's not a bad thing to do that. In fact, I think it's a necessary thing. That's why, you know, when I hear a lot of folks talk about, well, we have to engage in uncomfortable conversations or difficult conversations, I always encourage the changing of the descriptor to necessary conversations instead.
Right. And I know on this journey as a white woman educator, at first when I found out some of the practices that I was doing were hurtful to students, I was mad. I was mad at I think defensive first, if I'm going to be honest.
Sure.
And then I was mad at myself. And then I realized that I'm not here to be right. I'm here to get it right. And I put down the defenses and I just said, open your mind up and let's get it right. So as a white woman, and I have a lot of educator friends that do want to do better. And so there are ways that racism is manifested in education, and as a white woman, I'm oblivious to it. I don't even realize it. What are some things that I should be more aware of, and my white colleagues should be more aware of, that are out there?
Right.
We don't even understand.
No, I know it's there, but I guess the key with that is that inequities, racism, bias, denial of access is going to manifest itself across literally every single aspect of education. So, I would say the first thing is to understand that the curriculum by design upholds a racial hierarchy. It just does. There's a reason why, even some of the names that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, you don't find those names in the curriculum. I remember how I was extremely disappointed and quite frankly angry that my AP American Lit teacher in high school, we read, of course, the classics. And I remember wondering why, and even asking the question, why aren't we reading, Richard Wright or Langston Hughes? And he was just like, it's not part of the curriculum. And so not only was the curriculum by design set up to dehumanize and deny me access, and when I say dehumanize, for me, my experience in high school was my ancestral enslavement, Martin Luther King, and Rosa Parks. That's it.
Right.
So there's that aspect, and then if you think, and so again, there's the curricular part, and no, it's not just in English, it's not just in history, it's even in the sciences and the maths. You think about how it's taught and what representations of excellence or discovery or innovation are provided to students within those areas, and what is the demographic of most of those representations. And then, of course, you can even add now, which is it's one of the things I talk about now around the fact that, there's a big push around STEM and around coding, which I will share with your audience. I'm staunchly against coding as a standalone curriculum. I am in favor of computer science, but I am against only teaching coding, especially if you look at the corporate hierarchy of our big tech companies. Where do the coders lie in that hierarchy? And any schools or school districts that are only teaching coding are setting students up for a job that is already obsolete, because most of that task-oriented repetitive work is not, the tech companies, they outsource it. They outsource it for cheaper labor because it's task-oriented and repetitive. But then you also want to go into like the school culture. So, there's a reason why the data, still enduring data, big data, small data, what I always say is, I don't care if it's big or small, let's humanize it. When you look at discipline rates, when you look at rules set up that are under the veil of student safety when they really are more around student compliance. Then you can look at the, within the school culture, look at, as you even pointed out, the accessibility to extracurricular activities, especially if the barrier to entry usually involves financial access. You look at the fact that, and especially two of the schools that I worked at that were considered to be underperforming, which I'll share with that in a moment, underperforming, instead of ensuring that the schools had more access to more resources, it was, we're going to take away things like the arts, which, I'll have that argument with anyone anytime, that if you have students that are performing, let's say below capabilities, and I say that with an asterisk because I'll mention why in a second, then, to me, the response should be more of the arts, because I can make the connection between almost every subject matter and music, art, the arts in general. But I'll go back to the fact that, when you hear the term underperforming schools, usually it's not that they're underperforming, it's they're under-resourced. And then how do you measure those standards of performance? And if they're standardized, I can share with you that those standardizations are meant to maintain a racial and social hierarchy. I'll give you an example, and you may know this. You know that when the students were taking standardized tests, let's say they take a section of a test that has 60 questions, you know that 10 of those 60 questions are not scored. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, here, let me break it down to you on this one. This is how this stuff is institutionalized and racism embedded in it. So the students would take, because I remember this, the students would take a section of a test, and I'm just using a now nice round number of 60. So there's 60 questions on the test. Only 50 of those questions are actually scored. Those other 10 questions are sample questions or test questions, or they're questions set up to look at what demographic of students, zip code of school, how do they answer those questions? So if you have a large percentage of students from marginalized and oppressed zip codes answer a large volume of those 10 questions correct, they will not put those on the test. If you have a large volume of students from wealthy white suburban school districts who do answer those questions correct, they end up on the test.
It's incredible. It's incredible.
Yeah. And I was at a school where we were PI 3. And so here in the state of California, back not too long ago, what would happen is you had what was called your AYP, which was your average yearly progress. And that meant that you had to show performance growth at X percentage, and that percentage was your average yearly progress. So they would look at subgroups of students and look at their performances on the test, and they would aggregate all that to get your median performance, and then your median performance had to show an average yearly growth. Mm-hmm. If you didn't do it, and if I remember correctly, if you didn't do it 2 years in a row, you became a PI, which was Program Improvement School, which meant that there were going to be all these intervention strategies and intervention things they were going to do. Of course, none of those involve looking at the allocation of resources, one, or even scrutinizing the tests themselves, which by design were culturally irrelevant. They were culturally biased. Mm-hmm. So we were PI2 or PI3. And I'll never forget the beginning of that year. And by the way, that principal, I loved him. He was wonderful. He and I hit it off right from the beginning. But it was all around, okay, so how do we improve our test scores? Well, we need to do, problem-based learning, or we need to do, project-based learning. We need to do all these things. And I of course, was one of the, I want to say of a staff of 80, it was only myself and 2 of my colleagues. And I do want to stress that, and it's important for me to stress this in any platform I have, is that I was the only black male educator at the school, which I was the only black male educator at all of the schools I worked at in LA Unified. But at any rate, so I raised my hand and I'm like, well, wait a minute, let me get this straight. We want to improve test scores. I'm like, then we need to teach to the test. And of course, there was this loud, like, no, how dare you say that? How dare you say that? You can't do that. Mm-hmm. And I said, listen, let me explain something to you. I played football. If I want to be good at football, I don't go play basketball. I practice football. So you say, right. If you want to be good at the test, then you have to teach to the test. I'm like, it's a game. Don't you all see the game? And of course, like most of my colleagues were like, first of all, most of them were dismissive. And second of all, they were like, no. But at any rate, so PI 2 or 3, so of course they send in all these folks to try to tell us how that we're, change your pedagogy. You're not reaching the kids. You're not doing this. You're not doing that. We need to change our discipline policy here. We need to do this. So all these things. And to me, I was just like, even then I had the epiphany where I'm like, they're looking at everything but what the problem is. First of all, the problem is the tests themselves. Second to that, they stripped most of the students of their electives, and then they had to take either 2 English or 2 math classes. Mm-hmm. And, I just couldn't help but think that this school is under-resourced, yet in this community, the fire department and police department, they get all the resources they need to perform the essential functions of their job. Why doesn't the school get that? Yeah. And so ultimately, that school actually did do reasonably well on the test. And I remember even now, if you ever hear a school that they say a school is underperforming, then conversely, that means that other schools are overperforming. Right. Let's use a nuance of language.
Good point.
At any rate, the school did well. And I remember that year, there were a number of schools in LA Unified that did well. So you know what happened the very next year? They changed the test.
Of course. Yeah.
Can I ask?
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so it just seems like it's always set up for
failure. You can't set win. Up for failure instead of success, right?
Right.
Correct.
And I think your work. What did you teach when you were teaching?
So I started off. I have 3 certifications here in California: English, secondary, single subject, English language arts, social studies, and then career and technical education.
So you're all high school?
No, predominantly middle school.
Oh, okay.
Prior to that, I substitute taught for a number of years, and a decent percentage of my substitute teaching was what was called long-term assignments. So
Yes.
the areas I taught in early in my career were Southeast LA and South Central LA. So of course, there was a significant amount of teacher turnover.
Right.
Sure.
Under-resourced schools, teacher
Right.
burnout, very high.
Yep.
And so I ended up teaching, which I think it made me a much better educator in general. I had long-term assignments in math, especially 8th grade algebra 1, algebra 2, PE, art, science, and it was a couple of times with art. So it was in what would be visual and performing arts, but
Right.
and then, but ultimately as a full-time teacher with my certifications, I started off in English, then a number of years in social studies, and then my final 11 years in the classroom was in a technology lab, which was part of my CTE credential. At that school, they had a technology academy. So I had students that, were part of the quote unquote regular program.
Right.
I had students that were part of what was called the individualized honors program, which is, I don't really have anything positive to say about the structure of that program. And the kids, I loved them, but the program itself was very exclusionary, very exclusive. And then of course in the technology academy.
So then that's what brought you to merging your passions and what's fueled you based on your experiences and what you learned along the way, and be this Techquity leader that you are a mentor all over millions of people. So when you look at what we have to deal with now, if we're in person, if we're face to face, if we're hybrid, like how are we dealing with Techquity with all of these different situations? How are we doing this?
Well, I mean, we're doing the best we can for sure. I hope, I still even now, I still see what I call educational triage, because people are just trying to make the most of what they have. I'll say that it goes all the way back to the work that I did with our state superintendent when I was on his task force. It was not the current state superintendent, it was the previous one. Okay. But, I would love to see a collective voice, collective effort, and collective solidarity across the entire swath of education to push for the internet to be designated as a utility, because you still have urban families and rural families that do not have access. Yeah. I mean, I have friends that work in districts that, their districts could be 200 square miles. And they have families that, of course, they're either on farms or they're just in their home. They don't have broadband access. Yeah. And then, of course, the hotspot, again, is triage, because you hand out a hotspot. How do you know they're going to have there's a cell tower that's within a reasonable distance for those families to be able to connect in the first place? Right. Now, you go to the urban environments and you have the same thing around families that don't have internet access. And actually, I'm going to post this on social media because I think it's a legitimate question to ask. If I'm a teacher in a school district and I'm required to teach remotely, that means I'm required to do it to perform the essential functions of my job, key phrase. Shouldn't the school district be paying my internet bill? Yeah, I've seen that conversation. Oh, you have? I haven't. Okay, good. So people are talking about it. I have. I mean, just, digging through Twitter, I mean, I see those sorts of, either cell phone, right? Or cable bill, something to get that internet. It's a function of what I have to do. Correct. And of course, in the middle of a pandemic, right, when this first started, everyone just rolled up their sleeves and we do what we got to do. But now, if this is going to be the norm to some degree, how is this really going to take effect? And it's just, in fact, when this all happened, I remember it felt great to see all of these different tech companies, thousands of them, say, we're going to give you this component for free, this for free, this for free. And it was great until it got overwhelming. All right, this is a little ridiculous. We really only need 2 or 3 to get us through this. But it was really great effort. But I kept waiting and waiting. Where are the internet companies in this? Why? Where? Telcos, that's right. Where is this? How are they not part of this? No. Why are they not saying, Yes.
you get this for free. I
Correct.
didn't understand that. I kept waiting
Well,
and
so
waiting.
I saw, you're right. And I mean, look, I can be both simultaneously critical and levy praise to the tech companies. I think a lot of the tech companies have certainly eaten very well at the table of education for a long time.
Right.
And I can see both the benefits and the costs of them eating well at that table. I remember I was in, actually, well, I wouldn't say remember, but I was in LA Unified with that whole iPad situation as well. So, but you're absolutely right. So there's a couple of things. So one, the internet should be designated as a utility, period. I mean, to me, that should be a non-starter and a no-brainer. And
Agreed.
I know that that conversation has come up in Congress, and I know it's come up in the FCC. And I have friends that work in several, organizations, nonprofits, that they've been lobbying for that for years.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that, the idea, and I do think it's visionary and courageous leadership for a lot of superintendents that said, okay, you know what, we're going to get a bunch of hotspots, we're going to hand those out. And this goes to your point. So one, they had to buy those hotspots, which means they had to reallocate funding that may have been line item for something else.
Yeah.
But it still goes, it's still triage. It still goes back to,
yep.
Okay, if I'm a student and I got a hotspot, okay, one, that assumes that I have good access in my home because it still requires an antenna.
Yep.
And I can tell you that there are certain areas, especially in many of our major urban centers, there are certain areas, even within the city, where you don't necessarily have good access because are the nearest towers, what internet provider are the towers that are built, what internet provider is closest to me? Think about it. If you go around some of your major urban centers with your cell phone, watch your signal fluctuate. Okay.
Right.
So remember those hotspots still require that same signal.
Yeah.
They have bandwidth limitations. So all the teachers that, and I'm starting to see a collective pushback, thankfully, around things like demanding students have their cameras turned on, which is classism, or trying to do high bandwidth or bandwidth intensive platforms and applications. See, those hotspots have limitations. Right. And then what about in a home where you have, two working parents and then maybe even have siblings? What's going to happen with the internet connections? What's going to happen with the devices? You see, there's no, it's all triage. There's no, like, we have to have, to me, the whole thing that should be standardized, the only things that should be standardized in education are access and opportunity. And that access includes the internet. And to your point, I did see where some were like, well, we'll do low cost, $8, $10 a month. And,
right.
And I'm like, okay, that's all fine and dandy, but how about no cost based on a case by case basis? If you've got two parents that are working multiple jobs, it should be a utility. It's just the bottom line. Like, if as we see now, having access to the internet is just as critical as being able to turn on your lights.
Yep.
I mean, it is. It's just that's the environment that we're in right now. That's our society.
In fact, it's funny because mine was just down for the past 2 days, and I mean the stress level that I had, and that I called, and I need someone out here now. This is my job. This is my work. I have to be doing this, and this is how students, and relative or not, it does dictate success, right? Because in the future, I mean, this is not just future, but now. I mean, this is how we communicate. This is how we synthesize information. This is how we use our critical thinking skills and produce. And I love your point too earlier about coding. I'm all about integration, right? Integrating things, not having things as an isolated thing, almost like checking off like a list, saying, all right, I did that. All right, hotspots. All right, fine. You don't have this. Good, we're going to do hotspot. Okay, check it off. Well, okay, that maybe wasn't enough. So what are we going to do from there? Or, coding. Coding's a term. We're going to do this, right? We're going to have a little coding class, and now we can check that off the list. So when we are talking about making meaningful change, when we're talking about really taking true action and not just checking it off a list, that it's done in compliance, what does that mean? What does meaningful action mean in terms of equity, in terms of tequity, in terms of everything?
Right. I mean, I'm going to tell you, it requires bold and courageous leadership.
Yeah.
And I would say I recently have kind of shifted my thinking. One, we must decolonize the curriculum. The curriculum causes damage. I mean, it's interesting where the reaction again, oh, wait, no, the curriculum. Like, look, I can tell you that a close friend of mine is a psychologist. And if I were to describe the ways in which the curriculum can be anxiety inducing, dehumanizing, and quite frankly, violent, those all equate to abuse. And it's embedded in some of the standardized curriculum, by the way. So to me, that's the first thing. And of course, I know I've had dialogue with some folks like, well, if you know, some things have to be, you know, you have to make sure that they, that there's a standard. And I'm like, no, actually you don't. What you have to do is you have to make sure that the learning experiences for the students are culturally, contextually, and geographically relevant. So for example, a student who is comes from a family where their household income is $1 million. They live in a community where the median, let's say the median home price is $2 million. And, you know, they have a, you know, one or two parents in the home, and, you know, college is a given. In fact, grad school is a given. That student's learning needs are going to be different than most of the students that I had, where, you know, you have a two-parent home or a one-parent home, but both parents work. They might have several younger siblings. They're working either a low wage or a minimum wage job. You know, as I shared before, their community is very different by design. Their needs are going to be different. So it's irresponsible, and quite frankly, I think it's very problematic that in those two distinctly different scenarios, the kids are provided the same standardized curriculum.
Yeah.
And that in turn is why I think that, you know, going back to the way schools are vetted and scored, if you will, on their performance should be relevant and relatable to the environment that school is in and the resources that the school has. So that leads me to this. I am a firm believer in, and in fact, I've learned this in my conversations I've had with him, and he actually even has a book, his whole idea around people, idea, and policy. So I think that policy drives people more than people will drive themselves. And then policy leads to ideas. So Dr. Kennedy talks about racist policy leads to racist ideas, which leads to racist policy. So it becomes this vicious cycle.
Right.
There's a similar cycle to that in education. When you think in terms of policy, policy is a driver and the dictator to the actions of the people. And then the people are reinforce that policy, which in some cases dictates additional policy to reinforce that policy. Give you an example. Discipline. We have to have strong discipline, firm rules. And not only that, we're going to reinforce the need for conformity and compliance by having a school-based police force. And we're going to assign a police officer, but we'll call him a resource officer.
Right.
We're going to assign a police officer at every school site to be there to ensure student safety, wink, wink. But it's also to be an enforcer of the rules. And so what happened here in California especially is that you started to see, when it started finally being published, of course, because there were demands for that data, the disparity in suspension and expulsion rates among students here in California. And then when you started looking at the subgroups, you saw that it was a Black male or Latino student was 9 times more likely to be suspended than their white male counterparts for the exact same infractions on campus.
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to connect some dots for you, and this is for your audience. So what I point out now is that if you get a discipline infraction, i.e. a suspension or even expulsion, very early in your schooling, and in fact, one of the things I share, which is it's data that is important to recognize, is that the grade level that constitutes the highest percentage of Black male and Latino students being suspended or expelled from school is preschool.
Oh.
Yeah. So think about it for a second. What is the primary demographic of preschool teachers? What's the likelihood that in the context of their training, they had mandatory anti-bias and anti-racist training? What's the likelihood that that training is ongoing?
Ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then what's the likelihood that in the context of their certification, they've also had courses where you have to develop what I call cultural intelligences. Cultural intelligences are cultural competency, culturally relevant, and culturally responsive. What's the likelihood they've had that? So now they're going into these spaces where preschool is optional, another key word,
Yeah.
and they lack a degree of cultural intelligence to where they look at behaviors or mannerisms or behaviors that are normalized for students, and they differentiate them. They place a cultural, i.e. a social hierarchy onto them, and look at one behavior in one student as being outside their norm of what, or outside what they deem to be a cultural norm. So therefore it's not a cultural norm, so therefore it's defiant, so therefore I don't like it or I don't accept, so therefore they're not compliant with what I think is a cultural norm, and they react accordingly. And so what happens is that the minute you get a discipline infraction, you have an asterisk, and that stays in your cumulative folder or file until you graduate. And who has access to that cumulative file? The counselors, who are usually the gatekeepers to the classes you take,
Mm-hmm.
school psychologists, if they have a school psychologist,
Right.
who may or may not be in a position to be responsive to any of the needs you may have, and teachers. And so then this ties into the bias that teachers can have, which goes that whole thing. And so the reason why I'm sharing that is here in California, there was an enduring data around those suspension rates. So when I was in LA Unified, the superintendent at the time said, can't suspend students anymore. That was it.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no policy to back that. Well, let me rephrase that. The minor, if you will, policy was the superintendent said no more suspensions. But it didn't change the people, because you still had issues on campus where you had, quote unquote, discipline infractions. And in fact, I would actually argue that it created even more anxiety and more abusive environments in schools, because to me, the policy was no suspensions, but it wasn't backed with how are you going to support the people and how are you going to change the people? How does a policy change the people? It didn't change it. It changed the practice, but not the people.
Right.
Right.
And so then we have a bill that our governor signed into law on January 1 that you now can no longer suspend students K through 5 and have the designated reason behind that suspension be willful defiance.
Right.
So you see, that's now changing that's now policy to change the
Right.
people. What I'm not seeing is you can change the practice, but you cannot change the practice without changing the people. And so to me, what should be happening is, rewind back to that whole thing with that superintendent in LA Unified. What should have simultaneously happened is we're going to reduce our suspensions by X percentage over the course of this year. And these are the policies that I'm implementing, and these are the resources that I'm dedicating to implement those policies. Every school will develop a restorative justice program. That restorative justice program will have a restorative justice team. Those teams will go through trainings monthly that we will pay them overtime to implement in their school site. Every school site will report the success of that restorative justice program. These were the suspensions. This is how we reduced them. And this is the result of the restorative justice program that is aligned with the reduction of those suspensions. These are the teachers that are part of that team. This is the anti-bias work that we've been doing ongoing. This is the anti-racist work that we've been doing that's ongoing. All schools will be will have access to a school psychologist on a consistent and regular basis, as well as on demand based on needs. All school resource officers will be trained on supporting a restorative justice program, not an enforcement and compliance program, so that they truly are a resource on campus, not an enforcer on campus. You see, that's my point, is to answer your question. You have to have the policy, but the policy has to be backed up by how you're going to change the people, which changes the practice, which reinforces and supports that policy. If you don't change the policy, you don't change the people.
Right.
And if you don't change the people, you can't see a policy, or excuse me, if you don't change the policy, you can't change the people. And if you don't change the people, you don't change the practice.
Right. Yeah, there's got to be the follow through. It has to be authentic. There needs to be that accountability. But I like the point that you made, not an enforcer, but someone who's there to guide and to assist and to help.
I want to add one quick thing, because I think this is important too. One of the schools that I worked at, the school resource officer / school police officer, this the only, out of all the schools I subbed at and worked full time, this was the only instance where he wasn't an enforcer on campus. And I wish I had access to the data, but of course I asked for it, but it was never provided at that school. He looked at himself as, I'm here to ensure student safety, but I am a critical and important part of the school. And he's a good friend of mine. He would come by class and check on the kids and ask them, what are you learning? How are you doing? He would come back, if I'll never forget, it was a world history project that I was doing with students, and we were looking at social movements around the world over time. So, variety of different social movements is like, what is a social movement? Why do social movements happen? What are some, we looked at, I didn't look at historical study in a linear capacity, and I really didn't even go based on the standards, which got me a lot of grief, but I didn't care. I wanted students to be able to understand the fluidity of history and historical study and look at history through the eyes of a historian. And so we had overarching themes, and we would apply contemporary, recent, and then, past applications to our analysis of those themes. And so social movements was one, because another big one we did was the theme was migration, and the mass movements of peoples. But at any rate, I remember we did one, and he came in, because I remember I said, you should come by, you should see what we're studying. You would dig what we're studying big time. So he came by and he talked to the kids. What are you studying? Oh, we're doing this. And let me check out what some of the work you're doing. And of course, back then I did have access to computers. So I would say I had enough computers that half the class could be on a computer. Half of my class could have a computer that each student could use for themselves. And so he came by, talked to the kids. Then I was like, and he'd swing by. Sometimes if he's just walking, doing the rounds on camp, he'd stick his head in, wave, say hi to the kids and stuff. But I'll never forget this. He came by when the kids were done, because he said, Ken, tell me when the kids are done. I got to come by. I want to check out the projects. That looks like something that I wish I could spend more time in the classroom. And so he came by, and I got to tell you, and this is important for your audience. The kids were so proud to share, even with the school resource officer, the work that they were doing. And it really ties in, and it really validates what I talk about now around building a community of excellence in our schools. Every single adult on campus has a role in the experience that the students have, whether it's the support staff in the office, the food service staff, the maintenance staff, they all do. And that's one. I mean, I know we don't have time, but I have examples all across the board. But I'll just remember, and I remember that the kids were like, officer, and they were like, oh, he's cool. And I don't know if there was a direct correlation, but I gotta believe that if you look at for example, the resource officer as looking out for your success and your interest, and yes, his role there is for your safety, and yes, there's going to be situations that inevitably are going to occur that are around conflict or a compromising of student safety, but you don't look at the officer as being in an adversarial capacity, right. Look at it as an advocacy capacity. I just got to believe that that's going to reduce overall instances on campus where, it becomes this adversarial relationship between the students and, in this case, a school resource officer. But I just remember that. And I just remember, why can't it be like this at every school?
Yeah.
If you're going to assign a resource officer at school, then let's support them truly being a resource, not because there were a couple of schools I worked at where they were enforcers, man. The kids hated them.
Yeah.
They hated
Yeah.
They hated them big time. They were like, man, I can't stand that officer. They look at me like I'm beneath them. And I mean, they hated them. And I remember
what's the point of your role, right? Yeah, I mean, it really is an important factor because, and really, like you said, any person in a school, it's about compassion, humanity, and about making connections and respect. And when there is that mutual respect, then people learn to respect themselves and respect others and respect that community as a whole. Yes. But like you said, it's and it shouldn't just be that guy was cool and that's his personality. It really needs to be ownership with everyone involved, just like you said.
Exactly. So ultimately, in a very long way, to answer your question, I really think we need to do a better job of scrutinizing the policies that are in place, and school leaders need to ask themselves, questions like, does this policy decrease, increase, or uphold obstacles for student access and opportunity?
Yes.
How do my decisions filter down to the experiences the students have? Jerry, you'll appreciate this one. I remember I did a workshop for superintendents out here back in January, and I literally, and I learned this from a friend of mine, I literally asked everyone in the room, how many of you are first in your family to go to college? And I would say in a room of probably about 100 superintendents, at minimum half the hands went up. And I said, okay, so here's my challenge to you. You are the driver of policy, and your strategic plan is your articulation of that policy, as well as board goals, of course. I said, you are in a unique position to ensure that any obstacles and barriers that you had to navigate are dismantled for all the students that are in your school district right now.
Absolutely. Yes.
I'm like, and to me, that should be your default decision making. What obstacles did I unfairly and that I had to overcome? Part of a structure. I mean, we could argue as to the fact that you did, but the bottom line is you made it. I don't believe in this, trial by fire, rite of passage mentality of, well, if I had it hard, then all the students need to have it hard because, that just upholds a myth of meritocracy, which is a byproduct of institutionalized racism. It's this idea that you can make it if you just simply work hard, and it does not interrogate our systems that are in place. But I said that, and they were like, oh yeah. So back to your question, I do think interrogating our policies, looking at the curriculum, looking at the culture, all of those things we really need to really do, because otherwise, sadly, there's going to be yet another generation of students that we will not, as a society, put them in a position for access and opportunity to be successful. And what I don't understand that people are not able to connect the dots on is every time a student is incarcerated, every time a student drops out, every time a student doesn't have access and doesn't have an opportunity, that is human capital that we as a society have lost out on.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that it's really important, the idea of, and just always asking yourself, what is the purpose of this, and is this actually going to uphold this access and opportunity, or is it actually going to limit that?
Right.
It must be, the work that you do is absolutely inspiring, right?
Thank you.
Of course. And your goal is to help school leaders, help everyone in the school community be able to make meaningful change, be authentic in things that they do, right? Continue with follow through.
Right.
But it also must be very frustrating for you at the same time. How do you overcome that? I mean, you must see just this vicious cycle all the time. Right. So, I mean, I know what you're doing to overcome. You're trying to educate all of us. But at some point, it must hurt your heart sometimes, too. You must feel defeated sometimes.
It does. And that's where I do a much better job of it now than I would say I did 5 years ago. And that's where you have to really be mindful of self-care.
Yeah.
I share with a number of my friends that, self-care is not selfish. And, I shared in one of my talks, one of my favorite recent books that I read is The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. And one of those is always be your best. And, some cases we need to rest to be our best. Mm-hmm. We also have to recognize that being our best does not mean that we are always at our best. Juxtapose that, be able to differentiate between those two. And, I guess for me, it's a whole idea around coalescing around a community of excellence and those that recognize that, there's work to be done. I do encourage educators in general. In fact, I had this interesting debate in a recent talk I did where there was a comment made by an individual that essentially the comment was, oh, great, I'm learning for someone who doesn't have a PhD and I do. And I just said, look, I think it's important to recognize that There's a lot that we know, and there's a lot that we don't know. And the more that you embody a mindset of cognitive humility, the more that you will be able to learn what you don't know, rather than automatically be dismissive based on, some letters that you happen to have after your name.
Yeah.
And then I went into the whole thing around, I would have an EDD right now, but remember that whole access and opportunity thing? I have to be able to afford it. I have to be able to dedicate the time to it. I'm willing to dedicate the time, but still have to be able to afford it. And I just said, I would encourage you to really think about the fact that you're applying a value to having a doctorate. That means that you're still operating within a system that really, really, really limits access and opportunity to even something like that. I'm not going to take out a student loan that ultimately has me indebted for the remainder of my life based on, to achieve something that, will give me this degree of credibility before you even get to know who I am. Right. There's if you're going to judge a book by its cover, at least take the time to read the stories. Yeah. So,
Ken, you are so inspiring. I want to get one more nugget out of you.
Okay.
So I have heard you talk about, I think it's the mirror, the window, and sliding door, and that just struck home with me. I think it would with our audience.
Yeah.
We only have about 9 minutes left. Can you do that one in 9 minutes?
No, I can do that very quickly.
Thank you.
So it's the whole idea around our learning culture. So that's a part of the talk I do and the workshop I do around learning culture, and it's really more geared towards school leaders, but also really teachers, because it goes back to what we were talking about earlier around things like the curriculum, school environment, things like that. That's why I call it learning culture. And so it was originally developed by Emily Stile, who I believe she still is with the SEEDS project. And the idea around a student experience should be, originally it was a mirror and a window. So in the context of my learning environment, my learning experience, my learning culture, which all encompassing, I should be able to see representations of myself in an authentic, in a positive capacity. That would serve as a mirror. See, the whole idea is for us growing up and the way our brains develop, if we don't see it, then we don't necessarily believe it. And this goes back to what I was sharing around racism embedded within standardized curriculum and within learning culture. I did not see representations that look like me in regards to math, science, the books that I was assigned, all of those things. So you see, if you don't get that, if you don't see it, then you won't necessarily believe it. Then in turn, there's also the window, which means that my learning experience should provide me a window into, cultural differences or experiences of those that I don't share the same cultural identity with. And of course, I would say one of the main components of that cultural identity is your racialized identity. Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop at The Ohio State University added sliding glass doors to that, which means that in the context of your learning experiences, periodically, you should be able to go through a sliding glass door and immerse yourself into that environment of those of which you don't share the same cultural identity. The easiest example I can share with your audience on that is when students read novels that are of a utopian or dystopian society, and especially, if you think in terms of like Hunger Games is an example of where, it's, I forgot the main character, Jennifer Lawrence character's name in that.
I don't remember.
Drawing a blank, but at any rate, if I'm a teenager, I can relate to her character because of her age. And then if my gender identity is female, then also because she's a girl. And now I can say, what would it be like for me if I were in that world in her role? So that's the sliding glass door. And so ultimately we want to be able to do that. But if you look at the curriculum, how often are those mirrors provided to historically oppressed and marginalized students? And it's very dangerous and very destructive on both ends. So one, for those that are constantly provided opportunities with the mirrors, is you get an overinflated and overrepresented sense of self that can turn into, it creates a myopia of your perspective on culture and on identity. And then in turn, for those of us that are of a marginalized or oppressed identity, we don't get any representation of ourselves. And so therefore we don't see it, therefore we don't believe it. And it equates, I could use descriptors, but it essentially equates to degrees of abuse, because what you're saying is that it's a type of dehumanization.
Yeah.
And so that's where you get in the whole idea around things like, I encourage teachers, when you are designing slide decks, what are the images that you're using on the slides? What stories do they tell? What are their representation? When we go back to using our school facilities, what are the posters that are on the walls? When you're using videos, what are the representations in the videos? When you look at the textbooks, which I would love for more and more school districts to reject the textbooks and adopt media literacy and information literacy and put technology in the hands of all the teachers and students. The whole point there is that when you start looking at representations along a wide swath of what I would call identities, race, socioeconomic status, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, ability, language, and religion, those are the main identity categories that I operate or I look at. What are the representation of those, and how does the curriculum weave within and in and out of those, so that a student's experience is very broad, very detailed, and provides a lot of depth into them seeing themselves in the mirrors, others through the windows, and periodically going through the sliding glass doors. And I'll add, Dr. Debbie Reese, who is a First Nations or Indigenous professor, added that sometimes those windows have curtains because not every culture is just open for you to there freely look at. You have to make an effort to pull the curtains back to be able to look into that culture. And that was her statement around that was more around, not more, but it was certainly apropos to our Native people's cultures, because they're not there for you to be, oh, I'm going to look into your culture. You got to make an effort.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think the hardest part of this podcast is stopping it.
Yeah.
I mean, listen to you all day, Ken. You just broaden my perspective and make me think, and I love it. And I know our audience
stay in
will
touch, but I appreciate it.
I was able to enjoy it a little bit more after I was able to get rid of the starstruck, feeling that I have, because I get excited, that
we're in this together. No starstruck.
I know.
But thank you.
I know. But yeah, I mean, we're really, it's just, because obviously I follow you on social media and try to learn from you from there. So we were so excited that, Jerry was able to get you on board and bring you to our audience. I mean, so I just can't wait to go back and watch this again. And that's the idea. It needs to be ongoing. This can't just be, because otherwise, because my heart hurts always when I hear things and I see things, and it can't keep going in this circle. I mean, when I was teaching in the 90s, of course, in the textbooks, we had everyone, again, check off this person. There was someone in a wheelchair. There was someone of color. There was and okay, good. That was done. That was checked off for them. But that's not, you need to get past that mirror. It goes deeper than that, just like you said.
Correct.
So these layers are so important, and we'll just continue to learn from it. And hopefully there is not that train, and instead that light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
Thank you for getting up every day and sharing the message and broadening our perspectives. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate y'all having me on, and this has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, and again, what links us, I think, really, to sum this all up, is compassion and humanity, and that's really the ultimate. We just have to look at that as our goal, and we will all be, hopefully, in the right direction.
Thank you for listening. And if you would like to stay linked up, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify, and subscribe to us on YouTube.